It was a Monday, like any other. The sun had just risen, and I was already at my desk in the corner of the office, the low hum of the building's heating system keeping me company as I sifted through my emails. I had been with Stratton Enterprises for 32 years. 32 years. A lot of time to give to a company that had seen me through the most significant moments of my life, both personal and professional. I'd started as a junior consultant, fresh out of college, full of ambition and determination. Now, all these years later, I was Senior Vice President of Operations, managing teams across several departments. I had been through it all: market crashes, management changes, mergers, and acquisitions. I had weathered every storm and emerged victorious, always with the company's best interests in mind. My work ethic, loyalty, and results spoke for themselves. I had earned my place here. That morning, as I sat in my office, I had no idea that the phone call I was about to receive would change my life forever. It was Mark Denton, the newly appointed CEO. He had just taken over the role the day before, after the sudden departure of the previous CEO, Michael Pierce, who had been with the company for over 2 decades. Mark was young, ambitious, and had a lot to prove. His reputation in the industry was impressive. He'd been brought in to lead the company into a new era, one that would be more modern and progressive, according to the board. But I had heard rumors, whispers among the staff, that he wasn't exactly the most people-friendly leader. I had never personally met him before, but we'd exchanged pleasantries during the transition period. He seemed confident, maybe even a little too confident, if I'm being honest. But that was to be expected for someone who had worked their way up the corporate ladder, and I respected his drive. So when his assistant called and told me that he wanted to speak with me in his office, I thought it was just another routine meeting. Maybe he wanted to discuss some new initiatives or ask for my input on a project. I gathered my things, my notes, my cup of coffee, and made my way to the executive suite. As I walked down the long corridor, I felt a strange sense of foreboding, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The office building was quiet, most employees still deep in their work, but the tension in the air felt palpable. When I reached his door, the assistant ushered me in with a smile, though there was something almost forced about it. Mark was sitting behind his desk, looking down at a set of papers. He didn't immediately look up. I took a seat in the chair across from him, waiting for him to acknowledge my presence. He finally lifted his gaze, gave me a curt nod, and set the papers aside. "Good morning, Carl," he said, his voice cool, almost clinical. "I won't waste your time." I nodded in response, unsure of where this was headed. "I've been reviewing the company's current structure, and after careful consideration, I've made some decisions about the future," he continued. There was no warmth in his voice. He was all business. I had seen CEOs before, but there was something different about him. It wasn't just his youth or his crisp suit. It was his detached, almost emotionless demeanor. I listened carefully, waiting for him to explain whatever new initiatives or strategies he had in mind. "I'm afraid," he paused, adjusting his glasses, "that I've come to the conclusion that we need to make some changes in order to stay competitive. We're in a rapidly changing market, and the company needs to stay relevant." I nodded again. I had heard these kinds of speeches before, the kind that signal some kind of restructuring. It wasn't unusual. The corporate world thrives on change, often at the expense of those who have been around too long. But what he said next hit me like a ton of bricks. "Carl," he began, his tone still detached, "I've reviewed your performance and I respect your contributions. But here's the thing. We need to modernize the company. Employees over 55 years of age tend to hinder that image. It's nothing personal, but I've decided that it's time for you to move on." My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. I had worked for this company for over 3 decades. I had given everything. And now this man, who had been with the company for a matter of days, was telling me that my age, my experience, my value was no longer needed. I could feel my face flush, but I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I had been around long enough to know that arguing with a CEO was futile, especially one who had already made up his mind. He continued, "I know this might come as a shock, but the company needs to move in a new direction, and part of that is streamlining the workforce. We're bringing in younger talent, people with fresh ideas, people who understand the new vision I'm implementing." I felt my heart sink. The words he was using were so impersonal, so cold. There was no appreciation for everything I had done, no recognition of the years of loyalty. It was like I had become a number, an expendable cog in a machine that no longer had a use for me. I looked at him, and for a moment, I wanted to say something, anything, to defend myself, to express my frustration, to remind him of the countless hours I had put in, the sacrifices I had made. But something inside me told me that would be a waste of breath. So, I didn't say anything. I simply nodded. "I understand," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "If that's what you've decided, I'll pack up and leave." Mark didn't seem to care much about the impact of his words. He simply gestured toward the door, already moving on to another task. "Please do so by the end of the day. We'll take care of your severance package and benefits. Someone will walk you out." I stood up, silently, and gathered my things. I couldn't help but feel the weight of every one of those 32 years pressing down on me. All the relationships, the projects, the late nights, the decisions I had made, all of it felt like it was being wiped away in an instant. I walked out of the office, my mind racing. I didn't feel angry, no, not yet, but I felt something deeper, something colder, a sense of betrayal that cut to the core. I knew Mark had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no clue about the things I had access to in the building. I had always checked the security footage at the end of each day, a habit I had developed after all these years of being responsible for the operations of the company. It wasn't just a part of my job. It was something I did out of routine. And today I decided that I wouldn't leave without one last look. I wasn't sure what I would find, but something told me that this wasn't over. As I made my way to the control room, I felt a strange sense of purpose. Mark Denton might have just made a mistake, one that he would come to regret. After my meeting with Mark Denton, I went through the motions of packing my things and saying my goodbyes. I didn't let anyone see the anger or the confusion that was boiling inside of me. To the others, I was just another employee being let go in the name of progress. But inside, I knew I wasn't done. I had been with Stratton Enterprises long enough to know that there were things happening behind the scenes that most people weren't aware of. As senior vice president, I had been given access to a lot of the company's inner workings, including the security system that monitored the entire building. The cameras were placed in every major area, including all of the executive offices, and I was one of the few people who had unrestricted access to the footage. It was a privilege I had earned over the years, not because I needed it to monitor anyone, but because it had become part of the routine to review the tapes at the end of the day. It was a way of ensuring the safety and integrity of the building, or so I told myself. In truth, it was just something I had done for years, like clocking out at the end of the day. That day, as I made my way to the security control room, I felt a strange pull. I wasn't sure why I was heading there. I had nothing to prove, nothing left to do at the company, but something inside me, something nagging and persistent, made me feel like I had to check the footage. Maybe it was just the feeling of injustice weighing on me. Maybe I wanted to see if Mark's abrupt, almost casual termination of my career had been caught on tape. The security room was quiet when I arrived. The screens flickered as the cameras captured every angle of the building. Rows of monitors displayed footage from conference rooms, hallways, and even the cafeteria. But my attention immediately turned to the footage of Mark Denton's office. It was illuminated on the center monitor, a stark contrast to the other darkened offices. I tapped a few buttons on the keyboard, and the footage from the previous few hours began to play. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Mark was seated at his desk, looking over papers, then making phone calls, the typical actions of a CEO. He didn't seem out of place, but as I continued to scan through the footage, something caught my eye, an unusual movement in the corner of the screen. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew it didn't belong there. Mark's office was supposed to be private, but I was one of the few people who had the right to monitor its activities. The footage showed Mark speaking to someone. At first, it seemed harmless, just a meeting, a discussion. But then, the person he was speaking to came into view. It was a young girl, no older than 15, with long brown hair and a simple school uniform. She entered the office without any security clearance, which in itself was highly unusual. I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting at the image to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting what I was seeing. Mark seemed to be talking to her for a few minutes, a conversation I couldn't hear, but from the way he gestured toward the chair in front of his desk, it was clear this was no casual meeting. The girl sat down, and Mark stood up. What happened next made my stomach drop. He locked the office door. I paused the footage, my heart racing. I had seen enough to know this was not normal. It was one thing for the CEO to meet with people, even young employees. But it was another thing entirely to lock the door behind them and keep things private in such a manner. I knew there was something off about Mark Denton the moment I met him, but now I was certain there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't look away. I resumed the footage, watching as Mark and the girl remained in his office. The atmosphere seemed to shift, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. Mark was pacing around the office, his movements erratic, while the girl sat stiffly in the chair. I couldn't hear what was being said, but the body language spoke volumes. Mark's gestures were too aggressive, too pointed. The girl looked nervous, glancing toward the door every few seconds as if she were considering leaving, but she stayed in place. Then, my mind started to race. This wasn't just an inappropriate situation. It was something worse. I had no idea how deep this went, or how long it had been going on. But I knew one thing for sure. This had to be investigated, and it had to be reported. I wasn't going to let the CEO get away with something like this, no matter how powerful he was. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. I had always been someone who believed in the system, in doing what was right. But this was beyond anything I had ever expected to encounter in my career. I had worked with Mark Denton for less than 24 hours, and already I had uncovered something that made my blood run cold. I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't let this go unnoticed. But at the same time, I had to be careful. Mark Denton was not just a new CEO, he was a man with immense power, someone who could easily ruin me if he felt threatened. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined, and now I found myself caught in the middle of something that could destroy not only my career, but the integrity of the entire company. As I reviewed the footage again, I knew I had to find a way to expose the truth. But how? How could I possibly bring this to light without putting myself in danger? What if Mark found out what I had seen? What if he came after me next? The room felt colder than it had ever been before, and I knew I was standing on the precipice of something far bigger than I had ever anticipated. The next few hours felt like a blur as I sat there, alone in the security room, replaying the footage over and over. The images on the screen were burned into my mind, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I had seen enough to know that something was deeply wrong, but it wasn't until I started to pay attention to the details, really focusing on every movement, every second, that I began to piece together the full picture. What I had initially thought might have been a moment of misjudgment or an isolated incident was in fact something far more disturbing. I found myself rewinding the footage, trying to see if I had missed something earlier. As I went back through the recordings, I noticed that Mark Denton's behavior was far more calculated than I had first realized. The way he kept the young girl locked in his office wasn't a mere mistake. It was purposeful, and his movements, the way he interacted with her, felt almost predatory in nature. My stomach churned as I saw how he paced around the room, making sure that the door was firmly locked and that no one else could enter. I shuddered, realizing that I was witnessing something that shouldn't be happening in any professional environment, let alone one that I had worked in for decades. It wasn't just the locked door or the strange body language. It was everything that followed. As the footage played on, I saw Mark make gestures that were undeniably inappropriate. He moved closer to the girl, standing far too close, and the conversation seemed to grow more and more intimate in a way that didn't fit the context of any corporate meeting I had ever witnessed. I could see the girl's discomfort. She fidgeted in her chair, kept glancing at the door, and did everything she could to avoid eye contact with him. She looked trapped. I stopped the footage again, my hands trembling. I had to keep it together. I knew I had to remain focused, but what I was seeing on the screen made me question everything I thought I knew about Mark Denton. This wasn't just a bad boss. This was someone who had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. The more I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Mark had been engaging in this kind of behavior for some time. I skipped through different timestamps, moving to other parts of the day, and in each one, the patterns began to reveal themselves. It wasn't just this girl either. As I went through the footage, I discovered other unsettling moments where Mark was with different individuals, all of whom appeared to be either very young or not properly vetted for such close personal meetings. It was disturbing to realize that Mark had been using his position to manipulate situations for his own gratification. I had to stop for a moment and take a breath. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just about a bad CEO, a power-hungry executive. It was about something far worse. And as much as I wanted to turn off the screen and forget it all, I knew I couldn't. I had a responsibility now. I couldn't just walk away from this. I couldn't unsee what I had witnessed. The full extent of what Mark was doing was far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first met him. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a crime, and I had proof of it. The recordings, the timestamps, the evidence of his actions, they were all there, sitting in front of me, undeniable. I spent the next several hours meticulously documenting every piece of footage, every action, every moment that proved Mark's behavior was criminal. I made notes on the timestamps and created a log of everything I had seen. I knew that I needed to be thorough because if I was going to expose him, I had to have everything in order. There was no room for error. I couldn't let this go, not when I knew what was at stake. Every time I thought about what I was about to do, a sense of dread washed over me. Mark was powerful. He had connections, influence, and money. He could ruin me in an instant if he knew what I was planning. But I also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. I had seen enough to know that this wasn't just about a bad boss. It was about protecting the people who were vulnerable to him, about ensuring that what happened in that office didn't happen again. As I finished documenting the last of the footage, I took a step back and stared at the screen one more time. It was all there, everything I needed to take him down. And yet, as I prepared to send this information to the board of directors, a part of me felt terrified. What if they didn't believe me? What if Mark was powerful enough to make this all disappear? But deep down, I knew I couldn't back down. I had worked at Stratton Enterprises for 32 years, and in all that time, I had never once wavered from doing the right thing. I couldn't turn my back on this now. Mark Denton's reign as CEO had to come to an end, and I would be the one to make sure it happened. The gravity of what I was about to do settled heavily in my chest, but I couldn't let fear control me. I had the truth on my side, and that was all that mattered. The next steps were clear. I would bring this to light, no matter the cost. I couldn't let Mark get away with what he had done. After hitting send on that fateful email to the board, I leaned back in my chair and took a long breath. It was done. But in reality, the true work had only just begun. I knew the gravity of what I'd done. Exposing Mark Denton wasn't just a matter of corporate politics. This was a fight for something far more important. It was a fight to protect people's lives, to ensure that someone like him didn't slip through the cracks because of his power and influence. Now, with the evidence securely in my possession and sent to the board, I couldn't afford to rest. The next steps had to be carefully calculated. I spent the following hours in my small office, reviewing every piece of footage once again. The enormity of what I had witnessed in those recordings still weighed on me. The thing that disturbed me the most wasn't just what Denton had done. It was the cold, calculated nature of it. He hadn't been reckless. This was premeditated. The girl who had been in his office, the behavior that seemed so off at first, was no longer just a weird occurrence. It was something far darker. The problem now wasn't just his questionable leadership. It was his disregard for ethics, boundaries, and, most importantly, the law. I set up my desk for the next stage. My mind raced as I thought through every detail of how I could make sure the board wouldn't dismiss the evidence or claim that I had fabricated anything. I knew they would want to investigate, but I needed to make sure they wouldn't waste time trying to discredit me. Mark Denton was a powerful man with connections, and if they even suspected this could blow over without the full truth being exposed, they would be eager to protect him. That's why I had to be as thorough and meticulous as possible. I had access to every security camera in the building, and I made sure to go through each recording, time-stamping the key moments. Each instance of inappropriate behavior, every glance and every movement was captured in vivid detail. I couldn't miss anything. The goal was to ensure there was no way for anyone to claim this was a misunderstanding or a one-off mistake. The footage needed to be undeniable. I paused every clip that featured Mark's actions, took screenshots of the most incriminating moments, and attached detailed notes about what was happening in each segment. It wasn't enough to just collect the videos. I needed to craft a narrative around them, one that left no room for doubt. So, I pulled out an old notebook, the one I had used over the years to jot down thoughts during late-night work sessions, and I began writing. I described what was happening in each video, the context surrounding the events, and the strange atmosphere that had begun to surround Mark's behavior since he took over as CEO. I included the timestamp details of the young girl's presence, her reactions, and how everything felt eerily calculated. I noted how the atmosphere in his office seemed to change, like he was more focused on hiding something than actually running the company. Every thought, every observation was carefully documented. I knew I had to be precise, so I also included detailed analysis of the company's history, the culture of Stratton Enterprises, and how a leader like Denton, who had been so quick to dismiss employees over 55 years old, didn't belong in a company that had thrived on integrity, hard work, and respect for every employee. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta. It was about preserving the company's reputation and ensuring that someone with a moral compass like his didn't tear it all down. The email to the board couldn't be an afterthought, nor could it be rushed. I wrote and rewrote my message, making sure the tone was professional and grave, but not so emotional that it might distract from the evidence. I explained how I had worked for Stratton Enterprises for over 3 decades, how I had always prioritized the company's success, and how I had never before felt compelled to take action like this. I laid out the facts, that I had gathered footage and detailed evidence of disturbing behavior from the CEO. I didn't need to embellish anything. The truth would speak for itself. The most difficult part wasn't gathering the evidence or writing the email. It was the decision to send it. Once it was out there, I couldn't undo it. My life would never be the same. But the alternative, letting Denton continue his rise to power unchecked, was unbearable. I had to do this. Not just for me, but for every employee at Stratton, for every person who had ever trusted this company to be a safe, respectable place to work. So, with a deep breath and a moment of clarity, I clicked send. The words were out there now, in front of the board, and there was no turning back. The investigation would begin. As I sat in my office staring at the screen in front of me, I realized that everything was about to change. And despite the fear creeping in, I knew I had done the right thing. I just hoped the board would have the courage to do the same. The days that followed my anonymous email to the board were some of the longest I had ever experienced. I found myself pacing in my small apartment, replaying every detail of the footage, the emails, and the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I couldn't shake the weight of what was coming next, nor could I escape the uncertainty of how the board would react. Would they dismiss it as an isolated incident, or would they understand the gravity of what I had uncovered? The response from the board was swift and deliberate. They set up an emergency meeting for the next morning, which left me with only a handful of hours to prepare for the confrontation that was coming. I had all my documents neatly organized, each piece of evidence cataloged meticulously, and my mind was focused. Despite the gravity of the situation, I felt an eerie calm take over me. I knew what I had to do. The meeting was held in the company's sleek glass-walled boardroom, a space that had always felt detached, clinical, even sterile, but today it felt suffocating. As I walked in, the long conference table stretched before me, empty chairs arranged around it. Mark Denton was already seated at the head, looking tense and unlike the confident leader I had come to expect. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made his earlier bravado seem like a distant memory. As I stood there, holding the manila folder that contained the damning footage, I couldn't help but notice the shift in power. The moment I stepped into that room, I was no longer just the employee who had been dismissed. I had the upper hand now. I was the one in control. I placed the folder on the table, taking my time as I looked each board member in the eye. I could sense their unease, their uncertainty, but I remained silent at first. There was no need for words yet. The evidence would speak for itself. Finally, I spoke. I've been with Stratton Enterprises for over 3 decades, and it's been my honor to serve this company. But the events that have transpired in recent weeks are nothing short of horrifying. I have gathered irrefutable evidence of actions that can no longer be ignored. My voice was steady, unwavering. I was no longer the man they had fired. I was a whistleblower, standing tall. I opened the folder and began to show the board members the footage I had obtained. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair as I hit play. The grainy footage played on the screen, but its impact was undeniable. The scene showed Mark in his office, alone at first, then with the young girl, the unsettling and inappropriate nature of their interaction, clear for all to see. There was no escaping it. The room grew dead silent as the footage continued to roll. A few board members looked away, as if they couldn't bear to watch, but I could see the horror in their eyes. One woman, her hand covering her mouth, whispered, "Oh my God, this is real." Mark's face turned ghostly pale as he tried to regain his composure. This is a misunderstanding. he sputtered. "You don't understand the context. It's not what it looks like." But his defense was weak. The evidence was damning. One by one, the board members exchanged glances, and I could feel the shift in the room. Mark's usual confidence, the very thing that had gotten him this position in the first place, was now crumbling under the weight of his own actions. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mark," I replied, my voice cool and measured. "What you're seeing is the truth. There's no explanation for this. This is happening under your watch, and it's your responsibility to stop it. If you don't, I'll ensure the world knows what's happening here." Mark tried to regain control of the conversation, but he was losing it by the second. His words were becoming more frantic, more disjointed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. There's context you don't understand." But the board wasn't having it. One of the members, a senior director, interrupted him, her voice shaking with disbelief. "There's no context that justifies this behavior, Mark. You need to explain yourself. Now." The room was filled with tension as the board members looked between each other, the weight of the situation settling in. Mark's arrogance had finally met its match. The man who had once been the golden boy, the progressive CEO everyone thought would take the company to new heights, was now a shell of his former self, desperately trying to dig himself out of a hole that he had no way of escaping. I remained calm, watching as the board moved swiftly to begin an official investigation. The damage was done. Mark Denton was done. The power he had once held was slipping through his fingers, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. The man who had fired me, who had insulted me, had now become a cornered animal. As the meeting adjourned, the board promised to take immediate action, launching a full investigation into Mark's behavior. I walked out of that room, knowing that the next few days would be critical. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The investigation into Mark Denton's actions moved quickly. Within days, the board suspended him, and an external investigation began. The evidence was overwhelming, and his downfall was swift. The media soon caught wind, and Stratton Enterprises found itself under a public microscope. As this unfolded, the board reached out with an offer, a high-ranking position as Chief Operations Officer. The offer was tempting, but I knew that returning to the company wasn't the right move. After all that had happened, I felt it was time to close this chapter of my life. I politely declined the offer and submitted my resignation. I had given 3 decades to this company, but the man I had once trusted as a leader had shown me a darker side of corporate life. As I left the building with my resignation letter in hand, I felt a sense of relief. The weight of the past few weeks lifted from my shoulders. I had done what was right, and I was free. It was time for a new beginning,